Bom, boa tarde a todos e a todas. A gente está começando mais um debate do História em Quarentena, um debate especial hoje, pela segunda vez, um debate em inglês. A gente dá sequência ao nosso tema da semana, que é produzir e divulgar história em tempos de crise, mas a nossa ideia hoje é ouvir perspectivas também de pessoas que estão trabalhando essas questões a partir de perspectivas e de contextos diferentes, e por isso esse debate especial. Queria, para justificar um pouco isso, falar rapidinho que a gente, aqui no História em Quarentena, já tem tido um público internacional, até porque dos 6 organizadores do projeto somos só 3 brasileiros, então a gente já tem tido algumas lives em inglês, várias em espanhol, vários participantes dos debates também em espanhol, e hoje estamos gravando aqui nosso segundo debate, que vai ser em inglês. O primeiro foi um debate especialíssimo sobre questões raciais, que quem não viu, recomendo que possa ver. Então, é uma proposta para ampliar nossos públicos, mas a gente sabe que, invariavelmente, isso faz com que também pessoas brasileiras, que são nosso público, que não falam inglês, fiquem um pouco limitadas. A gente vai se esforçar para legendar o vídeo, mas, enfim, o História em Quarentena é um trabalho super voluntário, que não tem recursos, então a gente não tem ainda perspectiva de quando vai conseguir colocar essa legenda no vídeo. Inclusive, se alguém aí estiver assistindo a gente e quiser ajudar com isso, é, será super bem-vindo. No mais, agradeço aí a quem está assistindo e vou passar agora para o inglês. Well, my name is Lucas Pedretti, and we're starting now a special edition of the History in Quarantine project. Today we're having a discussion about producing and publicizing history in times of crisis. And here with me are Professor Tanya Evans from the Macquarie University. Hi, Tanya.
Hi there.
Professor Li Na, or Na Li, sorry, from the Zhejiang University. I may have spelled it a little bit wrong, but I hope it's not that wrong. Hello, Na.
Hi there.
And Pedro Terres from the Federal University of Santa Catarina. Hi, Pedro.
Hello there.
And I will briefly explain what the History in Quarantine project is, then I will introduce our guests today and we can start the discussion. Well, this project, History in Quarantine, or História em Quarentena in Portuguese, was born due to the needed confinement because of the current coronavirus crisis, and our idea is to disseminate historical knowledge, taking advantage of the possibilities offered by digital tools to reinforce this sense of collectivity. Each week we have a team to discuss, and this week we are discussing how the crisis impacts the work of historians, and of course also how can historians contribute to the public debate in those times of crisis. History in Quarantine is coordinated by the historians Carlos Benítez Trindade, Mariana Menezes, Melanito Luat, Natália de Santana Guerelos, Paulo César Gomes, and by me, Lucas Pedretti. Well, here with us today, there are Professor Na Li. She is a researcher fellow and a professor at the Department of History in Zhejiang University. And her research focuses on public history and urban preservation. And Professor Na Li contributes to a better understanding of public history at an international scale. Professor Tanya Evans, she is an associate professor at the Macquarie University in Australia. She's the director of the Center for Applied History, a project that aims to highlight the role of historical knowledge in shaping public policy and the uses of history in the development of key institutions and within diverse communities. And Pedro Terres, he's a history undergraduate student in the Federal University of Santa Catarina, where he participates on the project Teoria da História na Wikipedia, and also being one of the co-founders of the page História na Wiki. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for being here with us, and I would start with a very simple question, but that is to set a common ground for us. And this question is, how would you define public history? Can we say that it's the same thing as science communication in history, that what in Portuguese we call divulgação científica? Is it the same thing? There are differences? How would you define it? can we begin with Lina?
Oh, public history. So I think the very definition of public has changed in the past few decades. So to better contextualize our discussion, I would like to just present a little like snapshots of public history in China. So to give you a kind of idea of where we are. So our audience in Brazil, in Australia, and other countries around the world will kind of know that public history is going to be defined in different contexts. So here in China, around the start of the 21st century, we have a diverse range of public histories emerged in, and like across China, we see a diverse group of professionals working with the historically conscious public to produce oral history with the cutting edge audiovisual media. So oral history is one kind of form of public history. It goes public at all social scales. And then we see ordinary people who are building their family trees and trace their genealogies. So previously personal and private history start to go to public. So family history in China has taken a populist turn. So later we have this a huge amount of like history aficionados are playing history video games, and we have a bunch of creative user-generated histories on new media platforms, including digital history, visual history, online commemoration, and citizen walking maps. So you see this kind of different dynamics we all call under the umbrella of public history. Just a handful of such activities growing out of the field of history, including oral history, family history, and genealogy. But a huge number of the activities are really not attached to any discipline. So they're just exploring the past in a different ways. So here, like in China, we just call it public history. So the very idea has changed, as I said, the public has changed. So we're not talking about just the mindless masses, we're looking for information. We're talking about groups of educated, thoughtful, and socially responsible citizens who are interested and are serious with history. So here is how we see public history. As a field, as a discipline in China, has evolved around the same time, but it was really in the last decade we see a rapid development in terms of public history courses, programs, scholarly journals, academic conferences, and training programs, which I'll come back a little bit later. But to long story short, public is changing. And so our definition and approach to public history has changed. So here's just how we define public history. So it's a history in the public domain, and working with a history consciously public to really build the history. So here we're actually not just talking about the cosmetic changes due to the digital media, or rather media technology in general. We're talking about the fundamental shift in the entire process of history making. So that's the power of public history in China today.
Tanya?
Well, as you see, you've upgraded the meeting. We've got unlimited minutes, so that's good. Yeah. So when I talk to my students and public audiences, I say very simply that public history is the production and consumption of history outside of academic context, so on television, on radio, in museums, the development of historical consciousness amongst ordinary people. But actually, it's not as simple as that. As Lina has pointed out, definitions of public history have changed over time. People often point to the 1970s as a birth of public history as a phenomenon, but that story is dominated by American understandings of public history, and actually it has a much longer genealogy. And I think that's why international conversations like we're having here today, and that you're encouraging amongst all sorts of historians around the world, are really important, because there's lots to learn about the different forms and definitions of public history in different national contexts. And even though there has been a kind of flourishing of scholarship around different practices and definitions and theorization of public history in different national contexts, we still have much to learn. And I'm a member of the International Federation of Public History, and we have lots of debates and battles over what is public history. So it's clearly still a term that's up for grabs. and we need to think carefully about how we use it. If only because it's really important at this moment, at this historical moment, to talk about the political significance of public history. And I think that's an opportunity that no doubt you guys are reaping as part of your project.
Pedro?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because public history is both a national and a global problem. We have lots of, each country has its own definition, its own problems, and its all inner workings of public history, and yet we have this kind of global dialogues that the International Federation promotes, and well, we're promoting this right now. This question about what is public history, I had to ask myself 1 year ago when I wrote the Wikipedia article for public history here in Brazil, in Portuguese Wikipedia. And I defined it as a broad field of practices where historians and non-historians, people that are attached to the history practice, bring history or history-related products to a broader public. But of course, I think it's much more complex than that. Here in Brazil, I like the discussion brought by Ricardo Santiago. He's one of the main people that were responsible for bringing and defining the field here in Brazil approximately 10 years ago in 2011 at the University of São Paulo. And I think his definition of public history and what problems that we have still
So I think it's recording. Pedro?
Okay. Well, I think it's interesting what Tanya said earlier about how the public history discussion about the concept of public history is both a global and a local problem. I think while we have forums like the International Federation that brings this discussion and incentives this discussion in different national contexts, I think each country has its own definition and it changes along time. I think the concept of public history in the UK and in the US is much different than it was in the 1970s. So I think it's and I like to define it, and that's how I defined when I wrote the Wikipedia article in Portuguese for public history as a broad field of practices. And as a broad field of practices that constitutes of history products and history doing when made by historians and journalists and non-historians, but history-related professions that aim at broader public. And that's the concept as simple as it can be. But of course, the discussion is much, much more complex than that. But as a broad field of practices, I think it's an ever-changing concept, and it, in a certain way, that's a good thing. As public history doesn't need to be a highly theorized and departmentalized concept. I think it's on the grassroots movement and the connection between people. And one of the definitions that I enjoy is from the Brazilian historian Ricardo Santiago, that he's one of the responsibles for the broadening of the discussion here in Brazil in the last 10 years, since 2011. And one of the problems that he brings forward about public history is that we need to think what kind of the relationship between us and the public is being made. Are we doing history with the public? Are we doing history to the public? Or are we doing history for the public? So, and that's one of the things that we must think about every time we're thinking about a history project, a history podcast, a history YouTube channel, public history projects in communities and local communities. And I think, of course, these problems are global, but as I said, they have very local characteristics, and that's that's what we're discussing here today.
And as historians, how do you apply the public history in your daily work? I mean, which public history projects do you take part of? Pedro can start this one. You already told us a little bit about the Wikipedia project. Can you tell us a little bit more what it's about?
Currently, I'm finishing still my undergraduate course, so I don't have lots of projects to talk about. But my main focus nowadays, as public history, is on Wikipedia. As part of the theory of history in Wikipedia project, the project Teoria da História na Wikipedia, that the Professor Flávia Varela and Rodrigo Bonaldo do here in the Federal University of Santa Catarina. I've been writing in the last 2 years Wikipedia articles on theory of history for a broad public, and this in a sense we reach thousands and hundreds of people every year. People don't usually have the notion of how much people read Wikipedia articles every day, but even scholarly articles about theory of history are actually accessed every day by 30, 40, 100 people. So this kind of work pays off in a public sense in the long run. But also, one of the problems I had with the project is the sense that we are producing these articles for the public, but we're not thinking about how the public interacts with the process of writing the article. So that's how História na Wiki, my Wikipedia, an Instagram page and Facebook page and Twitter account that me and my friend Lucas Pianta started during the quarantine. We bring historians that talk about Wikipedia and think about Wikipedia to talk about what public history can make us do inside Wikipedia, how historians can work inside Wikipedia to bring forward public discussions about how many articles about men we have in Wikipedia, and how little articles about women. We have more than 95% of the biographies in Wikipedia in English are about men, not about women, and that's a thing that we must combat. This is the so-called gender gap on Wikipedia. So this sort of thing is what we talk about. How little African history articles we have in the Portuguese Wikipedia, and the Portuguese word, Mozambique, Angola, Brazil, Portugal. Our history is intertwined with the African continent and African history, and we don't have articles or good articles about African history and slavery history in Wikipedia. So that's a place where historians need to act. I think I don't see how people that don't research these things are going to write this. We as historians, we need to bring this discussion forward, and we need to make this kind of these scholarly discussions available to the public. And Wikipedia is the starting point of any research. Every new subject, the first thing you do is open Wikipedia and research that. So it's really important that this kind of subjects are present in Wikipedia in a good way, in a scholarly manner. So that's the work I currently do.
Ina?
So okay, so a lot to talk about, but I was trained in public history in the United States, so naturally, projects, a lot of experience were in the States and North America and Canada. So I did the one of the first projects, major projects that I did is investigating one of the most multicultural neighborhood in the city of Toronto in Canada. And that project, that was the first time I actually started using public history techniques, methodologies, but most important, working with the public, that kind of philosophy in urban preservation, which ended up as a book, Preserving Urban Landscape as Public History. But in the last few years, I started to get involved in a lot of various projects in public history projects in China. In the United States, public history, as Tanya was mentioned earlier, was born to probably partly to resolve the job crisis back in the 1970s. The modern public history in China, born and evolved in the past 2 decades, is primarily technological driven. So here, all the projects, public history projects that I was involved in China, in different places, different provinces, and in different contexts, and I've never seen in Chinese history so many reasonably educated individuals collectively equipped with such a range of information and ideas, and never in Chinese history have there been so many people spend so much of their energies and time and money exploring the past in such a scale. So our projects, either in the museum or in the historic in the historic districts, or in the library, or even in the digital history projects, we're actually dealing with a totally different landscapes. If there's a single agency that actually transformed this landscape of public history from where I was trained to where I work and study and research, is that it will be the center of our debate, is the media technology. So it's fundamentally, the digital media has fundamentally changed the speed and scale of how Chinese, the public, access historic materials. So which actually sort of tilted the balance between the production and consumption of historic knowledge. That's while we talk about the different public history projects in a different context. So it's a very different landscapes, but it's actually exciting as well.
Tanya?
So I'm currently working on 4 public history projects. For the last 10 years or so, most of my research has been focused on family history. I think both Pedro and Lena have talked about the kind of burgeoning of genealogy across the world that plays out a little bit like public history, quite differently in different national contexts. So I'm finishing up a book that's comparing the practice and meanings of family history research in Australia, England, and Canada. So family history, for example, plays out differently in settler colonial nations. I'm desperate to find out more in Brazil. I was at a conference in Sao Paulo back in 2018, and it seems to me there's some really amazing work going on, particularly amongst those people who came from Africa, working on family history related projects, and fascinating stuff going on there. So that's one. On the family history theme, I'm also collaborating with family historians, writing an ordinary people's history of motherhood in Australia. A lot of my work has focused upon collaboration, moving on from shared authority through, don't worry, my dog's just gone bananas too. She was peeking her head on my laptop, just propping it up, but now she's like, where's that dog? It's in Brazil, Charlie. Anyway, yes, writing that ordinary people's history of motherhood in collaboration with family historians. I'm just going to have to let her out. I was just saying to the others when your internet dropped off, Lucas, that I've got a little side hustle in the history of sport. I wrote a community history of my local swimming club a few years ago in collaboration with historians and a heap of community members. And as a result of that, the State Library of New South Wales here in Sydney asked me to gather oral history interviews with famous female athletes, recognizing that there's a dearth of information and oral histories of female sports people and athletes. And so I've been gathering those oral histories that will be digitized by the library. And I've involved my students with that, my public history students in that process, which has been a fantastic process. And hopefully it will result in an online exhibition. And just this week, the Australian Research Council has funded another project, another collaborative project that I'm working on with a team of interdisciplinary scholars, with ancient historians, with archaeologists, with people who work in our Faculty of Business and Economics, and heritage consultants. And what we're going to be doing is examining a deindustrial landscape, a range of miners' huts in the Blue Mountains, the beautiful Blue Mountains, which is an environmentally significant site, was ravaged by bushfires at the end of last year. But those bushfires have cleared this amazing landscape, which means that there's an amazing amount of archaeological research to be undertaken there. And that's another family history project, another oral history project. So that's going to be exciting for the next few years.
We had a debate earlier this week about the same theme, but only with Brazilian historians. And I asked them about how they saw public history as a possibility of new work fields for historians. But the answer was actually not very optimistic. And how do you see that in your context? I mean, how is public history a possibility for undergraduate student in history as a professional career? And actually, that question is related to another one, that is, how is public history as an issue in the university, in the history courses in your context? Tanya, can you start?
Well, as Lena has pointed out, there's been a burgeoning of university courses, partly because it feeds into the neoliberal agendas of universities. We can say to parents and students, well, you can get this job if you undertake this arts degree. And that serves their purpose. And while I think it's really important that we teach our students transferable skills and encourage them to think about employability and what jobs they're going to get once they graduate, what's important to us, I think, as public historians in universities, is to teach our students the value of all the other skills that we're teaching them as well: thinking, critical analysis, and the kind of and the value of the scholarship that we're producing, that they will take on with them throughout the rest of their lives. And yes, I hope that we are producing opportunities for them to work in public history. In Australia as elsewhere, it's a tiny field with regards to the galleries, libraries, archives and museum sector, and most of them dream about either being Indiana Jones or about working in galleries, and they'll probably do neither, right? But so what we're to get, and also we have a lot of ancient historians that the school system bored by Australian history. So what we have to do is to kind of capture their imaginations with regards to the history on their doorstep, rather than look elsewhere and just sort of obsess about studying Nazi Germany rather than colonial Australian history. So for us, it presents exciting opportunities, but I think it's really important that, and especially now when all of us, in most of our constant critique, certainly in the humanities, within the university sector, and it's important that we really push back against that and, you know, reiterate to everybody the value of historical analysis and learning and consciousness, right? And I think that's what's really important for us moving forward.
Gina?
As I said earlier, so it's been really like last 10 years that public history started to catch up, you know, like within the Chinese Academy. So back in the 80s, we have a few articles here and there, just introduce what public history is, introduce, you know, how public history works in other cultures. Whereas in the last 10 years, we started to have, you know, like serious efforts from the academy to really push public history is to establish public history programs and courses in China. So I'm happy to be working with a lot of wonderful Chinese colleagues on, in this kind of process of establishing public history in China. So it was in the last, starting from year 2013, we had the first national public history seminar, and then you follow the different kind of conferences. So now we have the established journal, academic journals, and about 30 academic programs, and also different courses. So and also conferences. So this is an interesting dynamics there. If history has always been integral to our history educations in China, ever it's written into our, you know, there's a sort of like a documents in the we call it national compulsory education by our government since 1982. So you know, like as Tanya mentioned the ideology just now, and I personally think if, you know, using history as a kind of booster for national myth or civic passion and social cohesion is actually not unique to China. But whereas in China, where we have a lot of intellectual elites who have played a visible role in history, so in history education and teaching, and so that's why history becomes a little bit more celebratory. However, in the last few decades, I'm glad Tanya mentioned that, you know, so you use the word boring and that kind of things. The same thing happened in China. Paradoxically, history, you know, people started complaining, you know, like, you know, it's boring and irrelevant. We just separated part from their lives, and its employment aspects is its perspective is really bad. But history is thriving outside of academy. So here you see the history written in textbooks and delivered in classrooms and written in academic journals has become only one of forms of representing the past, and often is not the most effective forms to affect students' historic consciousness. So here we gradually start to see the public history elements walk into the traditional history classroom. I briefly give you two examples. The first project is about the National Youth History Recording Competition. Basically, it's an oral history project initiated by one of the very innovative middle school teachers to invite students from all over China to participate in this kind of, you know, oral history projects and write down their experience, their grandparents' experience, and so students were unexpectedly enthusiastic, and they finished their field works and writing with passion and creativities, which you rarely see in the traditional history classrooms. And so that's another recent example is from one of the very good middle school in Hangzhou. They to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So students in this school have actually worked with the Museum of Westlake in Hangzhou on an exhibit titled 7 Years in My Eyes. True, the theme is very patriotic and whatever, but the approach is very exciting because the students collected and interpreted family ephemerals and momentums artifacts and worked with museum professionals and put together an exhibit. I took a lot of pictures, and, you know, I think it's a well arranged, a well interpreted, well represented, you know, exhibit, and well received. And also they're involved in working, interpreting their family history with the public. So here we see public history is already impacted history education in China. I'll point out three. The first thing about historic thinking. So whereas, you know, public history can actually is already develop sort of like help students develop sort of reasoning skills, and you know, some kind of, it provokes your historic imagination. I think that's the word I want to use. And so, for example, teaching with history video games become sort of like, you know, start catching up in China, just because all the counterfactual movements, all historic imagination involved in this kind of a class that traditional history classroom can't really, you know, like, you know, equip students with that kind of skills, which is actually badly needed. The second is about the methodological implications here, because in public history, we always take students out in the field to do taking notes, sketches, and observing, and to really work with the public. That kind of skills they actually need when they actually finish their schools and go into the job market. And so that's they learn how to learn history in a really reflective manner. And then when they go back to schools and go back to the academic setting, they're not scared because they have the practical elements in their thinking to really help them build up the kind of history thinking process and analytical skills. And the last one, I think it's very important, is that public history actually can help students with the ethical and professionalism. So in Chinese historic thinking, we call historic ethics are usually grounded in sort of a moral integrity. You don't tell lies, that kind of stuff, which is perfectly true. However, in the context of public history, we see students are sometimes really face the kind of dilemma. I'll give you one example. When some of my students go into the historic districts, they're talking with people, the regional residents of the historic districts, and asking them about the idea about the demolition. So here you have the government voice and the residents' voice. How are you going to be selective when you're presenting this kind of history or preserving this kind of history, and for whom? So they're facing up this kind of dilemmas. Only public history projects can really expose this kind of ethical dilemmas and also the professional conflicts. So once they go through this public history training, and they're going to be not scared, because that's a fact of life. That's the kind of when history goes public, it gets messy. How are you going to work in a complicated situation, and how are you going to resolve the real problems without losing your moral and intellectual integrity? I think that's what public history can really bring into the history education, which is already initiated a lot of changes in China, both in the middle school and also in the college setting. That's why in the last 5 years we are trying to do educate the educators. We finished 3 national public history faculty training programs in different cities. So after those programs, we have about 30 public history courses, programs established across China on different levels, because you need the kind of skills to really get students trained and to be a good historian first and to be a good public historian a little bit later. That's how I interpret this whole public history and history education, and how they're going to affect the students' thinking and history consciousness. And it's started to be one of the very important forces in pushing the sort of educational reforms and history educational reforms in China.
Pedro, you are still an undergraduate student, and you already have a public history project that's very different, for instance, what I had during my years of college that were not that long ago. So something happened in Brazil in the last, in the last 5 years or something, that we are also seeing this discussion about public history growing up really fast here. How do you see that? Do you think that that has something to do with also the growth of negationism discourses in public? I mean, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I think we as Brazilians have the short end of the stick on this discussion, I think, about public history and the let's say the job market for public historians here in Brazil. I think, the discussion and the interest on public history as a concept and as a field of practice has been growing in Brazil. I think, we had the international event here in 2018. Tanya was here, and I think in the last 10 years the discussion has been brought to history departments across the country. We have study groups showing up on the north, on the Amazon region. We have on the northeast, on the big cities as Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Here on the south of Brazil, we have public history practices and study groups on almost every federal university here. But I still think public history is a difficult job title for any Brazilian historian. Our job market, let's say, I don't like that concept. I think it approaches to the neoliberal logic that Tanya said earlier. But I think there's very little space for public historians to earn money in Brazil right now. I think we live in a crisis on the public side. I think most of our foundations are being destroyed from the inside right now. I think so. This kind of funding is a rare news here in Brazil right now. So yeah, I think public history has been rising here in Brazil. As I said, there has been a lot of new Instagram pages and Facebook and YouTubers, and well, I think this sort of on the go and non-financial, with no financial gain, public history has been rising here in Brazil at the moment. But I think we still lack the training, as we don't have established public history courses. We have one master's degree right now on the State University of Paraná. It's the only course we have right now. And yeah, still the discussion is growing. In the last 10 years, I think every Brazilian history student knows about public history. It's a concept that is familiar to us. But Brazilian historians that graduate right now, they have two options. They can go to elementary school and primary school education, or they can go to their master's degree and to their doctor's degree to become university teachers, university researchers. I think in the big cities, São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, you still have some leverage. You still have some sort of job offerings in museums and archives, but at least here on my city, that's not an option. You have internships, but you don't have jobs that are offered. So right now in Brazil, I think the discussion is much behind than other countries, and I think in South America in general. One thing that it's on the, let's say, on the daily discussion for historians here in Brazil right now is our profession per se. We don't our profession as historians is not regulated by the government here in Brazil. We have a legislative process in the last 10 years that has been up and down. And this year, after it was approved, the President Bolsonaro just vetted the project, and we are currently on the professional limbo. So we live in a dire situation. I think it's no surprise for our Brazilian audience right now, but I think public history is in fact facing a huge problem, and it's a dilemma that we as Brazilian historians have to think about, and we are thinking about. The public discussion is on this matter right now. And I think, yes, the revisionist movement and the negationist movement here in Brazil and far right movements here in Brazil have been a large part of this new wave of historians that are taking up their cameras, they're taking up their phones, and started doing public history the way they know it. And that's public history in Brazil right now. We are stepping in the dark here. We don't have many university courses, and we are doing things on the go and learning from experience. And I think it's this brings a lot of questions and a lot of problems. I think we don't need to live in a country where every historian is a YouTuber and an Instagram poster. I think there's lots of problems with these platforms and doing public history exclusively in these platforms. But right now we need to take what we have. So yeah, I think this is the way we are finding to combat these narratives that are governing the public debate right now. slavery and dictatorship denial is the current norm here in Brazil in the public for the general public. So how we as historians fight that? We need to do what we want. We do what we have. So I think it's kind of on the sense. And one thing I want to say that as public historians, I think we need to look back on examples from other countries that worked in the past. Especially, I think we're in a similar fashion to the 1970s creation of public history as a concept and the discussions. I don't think that the concept on the United States of Robert Kelly, I think that still is some kind of there's problems with the concept, but I think we should approach concepts such as Raphael Samuel from the United Kingdom that worked with when he was thinking about public history, he was thinking about oral history and workers' history. And actually, from Australia, all of the green band movements and on the rocks in the 1970s and the 1980s, I read about that when I was writing the public history article for Wikipedia. And I think it's one of the great examples of historians working with the public in a political sense. I like what Marco Rovai, one of Brazilian's public historians that like to think about public history, says about radical public history. And I think that's the sort of public history that we need, a public history that is not afraid to be political and to engage with the political discourse about history on the actual context. Because we're losing the narrative battle right now. So we need to do with what we have. So yeah. Sorry to talk too much, but that's.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Pedro. Sorry, I'm just going to jump in here, Lucas, because what's striking me when I'm watching the news, and when the moment this disaster kicked off, I'd switch between the Australian news, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and a range of other national newses, and it was just extraordinary the different ways in which the crisis was playing out. But one of the, I know that what's playing out in Brazil is disastrous on so many levels, politically, socially, medically, scientifically. What struck me though, and having been in Sao Paulo back in 2018, I was amazed at the support for Bolsonaro from Uber drivers, from ordinary people on the streets that I'd talked with. And then when I returned to Australia, the same from the Brazilian taxi drivers as soon as I came back from the airport. What strikes me now is this kind of rising critique. And I think you're absolutely right, Pedro, that historians need to remember those 1970s moments. And I think that political activism needs to come to the fore of the work that we're doing. And we need to articulate it as powerfully as possible to as wide an audience as possible.
Oh yeah, I just want to add Tanya and Pedro. I think one quality that public historians should really have is that this courage and also the political savvy to really to confront the conflicts, and the public histories are political, and instead of dragging into this ideological fights, but historians need to use their skills and also their savvy to really interpret and work with the public. So also like in China, we you probably all know that probably in many countries as well, there's a constant battle between censorship and creativity. And I think people, I don't really want to complain, and I think that's the kind of, I call it, emotional intelligence, that, public historians need to have to really deal with you work with the system instead of against the system. So I think that's very important, to not be afraid of being conflictual and not be afraid of taking a stand. I think that's very important.
I just muted my microphone because I don't know if you can hear, but people are protesting against Bolsonaro in the windows right now. Although I really like to hear it, it's kind of
we can hear it, but I hear it in my soul.
That has lots to do with what Tanya said about how things were 2 years ago and those shifts now, but that's not our discussion today. I would like to enter in the context of the coronavirus crisis with you. I don't know how do you feel that in your context, but I think that here we are seeing a strong impulse towards the use of digital media for the dissemination of knowledge, not only in terms of public history, for instance, our project, the History in Quarantine, but also as something that was imposed to teachers in primary school and also teachers, professors in universities. So how do you evaluate these moments? In your perspective, will this moment change the way we do history and public history? Lina, can you begin?
Okay, so better evaluate this moment. As I said, you know, I briefly touched upon how public history works, and because as a field, as a social movement, and public history in China is already, it's because it's primarily technologically driven. It has already initiated a lot of fundamental changes, and you know, it's not just how public participate in history and how the experts presenting history to the public. More of its entire process of history making. We see the balance is tilted, you know, between production and consumption. So I usually say the public in China is presuming history. So here, if it's already initiated some very fundamental changes of doing history in China. So I see the current COVID-19 pandemic simply magnifies some of the changes. Just give you one short story. When the doctor at the peak of the epidemic, right now we call it pandemic, but back in February we're still epidemic in China, when Dr. Li Wenliang, one of the whistleblowers of the pandemic at the time, he died from the new coronavirus in February. There's a lot of politics here going on, but here I would like to discuss the instant online commemorations by our social media platform when he just passed away. So it's from all over the world, and the emotions were high, and you see the posts and the visual images and audios in real time. So you see there's a need there, and that echoes the sort of collective inner sense at that particular moment. So some people might criticize, say it's a lack of reflective and sustaining quality, that kind of this kind of stuff. But you know, you feel the need is there, and that's the moments that public history should intervene responsibly. So right now, so aside from the politics, we have. It's an informal survey. We know a lot of teachers and professors at different levels, in middle school and college level. They sort of ask students to document their lives during the quarantine, and so it's in different formats. But all of them take advantage of the social media, and another thing is that with all those national marching into the online instructions and teachings at different levels, starting from the kindergarten all the way to college, and you start to see this kind of changing dynamics during the pandemic, how the people experiencing history that is happening right there at that moment in that little space, and changing family space, and also the changing perspectives of the urban space. And so an interesting thing is that now they use things the quarantines, and so people can go out and take photographs and doing normal stuff they usually did about a few months ago. So you start to see another cycle of people rewrite part of what they call history. So it's very interesting. We started this kind of dialogues, informal dialogues, and I'll talk a little bit about our projects a little bit later. But definitely it has already changed the way how people interpret history, how they collect their historic materials, and all those kind of visual and audio, and it's digitally born stuff right there on their phone. And so that's it. I think the change is fundamental, and it's permanent on the way it's affected. The impact is permanent on the way we do public history.
Tanya?
I think that some of the creative possibilities that Lena is talking about there are exciting about the years ahead. I think that this crisis is forcing us to think about how we undertake our research, but also how we best disseminate it. You know, much of the work that I now do involves face-to-face contact, whether it's oral history interviewing, focus groups. I use a lot of focus groups and a lot of history harvests, you know, community collaboration. You know, we're going to have to rethink that for the next year, at least. I know my university ethics committee is not allowing any interviewing, even if it's socially distanced. So, you know, and I know that oral historians have talked about the possibilities of using digital technologies, but I also know lots of them are really pushing against that. I like to experiment, but the traditionalists aren't always so keen to do that. So I think that's a problem. Moving forward, I have PhD students who need to do oral history research. You know, we need to think about alternatives. On another level, I was set to go to many different international conferences this year, which, you know, I've always loved. I love travel. I love meeting and talking with people around the world, but it's obvious that we all have to think about not just, you know, COVID and our travel, but also the environmental impact, and whether this sort of collaboration and communication is sustainable in the decades ahead. You know, that 30-hour flight it took me to get to Brazil, you know, those 3 separate flights, you know, which is never fun in the best of ways, but exciting when you get there. You know, we need to think about that. And, you know, even before the crisis sort of loomed upon us, I was supposed to be at a conference in Belgium, and I did a video presentation of my paper. And I think that, you know, like we're using Zoom here, recorded Zoom to share, which we've all done very quickly, you know, in the last few months. All of us are doing this. We need to think about creative ways of doing this in engaging ways, you know, and we all know there's only so much attention we have for long lectures, whether they're in person or on the internet, and most of us have longer attention spans than the young students that we teach. I've flipped all my teaching since 2014. I don't know if Lena's done the same, but I'm at an institution that uses a lot of online teaching in the course of our work anyway. So most of my lectures are in video or audio format and have been for years. So in some ways we were on the front foot when this crisis hit, and we were well supported. But within the university sector, it's my experience that a lot of these resources are very, very expensive in terms of using technology and video production. And while universities might be willing to fund that for teaching purposes, they're not so keen to think about how they're going to use that for research purposes. So, you know, there's a lot of scrabbling for your own funds. There's crowdfunding for projects like you've talked about, Lucas, for this history in quarantine moment, and Pedro with Wikipedia. You know, it's absolutely dependent upon voluntary labor. And yes, we all need to do more volunteer work. And I think that's also one of the values of public history. You know, yes, we talk about employability, but we also need to talk about the significance of voluntary labor as citizens in all of our different national contexts. Yeah, I think there are so many ways in which our work has to shift, but not just in response to the current crisis, in response to much broader environmental issues that all of us are a part of. And I think we've got a lot to learn from that moment. And for me, it's those creative possibilities that are particularly exciting. And as a historian, one of the reasons I love public history is because it forces me out of my comfort zone. It makes me constantly think about upskilling or engaging with others who have skills that I don't have, working in teams to produce history in innovative and exciting forms. And that's where I see my path for the next few years.
Pedro?
Yeah, it's interesting because here I think I'm the one that is more near what could be called a digital historian, because I work with not only Wikipedia, but I research video games, I research YouTube and new media in general. But I think my answer to that is that I hope not. I hope that the way of this digital way doesn't last long before after the pandemic ends. This is speaking as an undergraduate student that is without classes right now. My university has no plans for returning not only presential classes, but long distance classes too. We're nonstop because I think here in Brazil, we still have a big problem about digital inclusion. I have many colleagues in my university that don't have a good phone that they can use to watch a class or more even more do research. So I think this is a big issue, and this is one of the main focus of the discussion on Brazilian universities right now, as a student let's say objective right now. I think this is on the main. We need to think about what students are we excluding from the process when we talk about digital classes and digital researches. And I think, of course, in the United States and in Australia and in Europe in general, the issue is much smaller than here in Brazil. Federal universities in Brazil have a strong sense on being accessible for people of all kinds of backgrounds, and that's the virtue, I think, of the federal universities on the last 20 years. We have a big change towards inclusion in Brazil right now, and I think the pandemic, not only with the health system, but also with our educational system, has shown its weaknesses. My university doesn't even have a platform that they can use to make digital classes. We were caught totally off guard. So, and on the other hand, I think the pandemic alters our way of dealing with our day-to-day research, our day-to-day studies. I was in the middle of writing my graduate thesis for my undergraduate course, and I currently I'm still having issues to start writing it, because you got cut off from your friends, from the library, from your teacher that helps you during the research. And currently, and on the other hand, currently my academic life is basically watch professors from different universities talking like we're talking right now. Here in Brazil, we had a great shift in this in the last 2 months, not only through História em Quarentena, but laboratories all over the country are talking about public history and history in general in Brazil. And I think this is a great way of divulging and broadening our discussions that are normally located on the specific universities. In that way, I think this is a positive change, because we have a lot of professors that are now learning to talk through microphone, through Instagram, and through Facebook. But as I said earlier, I think it's a dangerous path for us to think that we are doing public history and we are doing our job as social agents and social professors and teachers when we are only talking to 20, 30, 100, 150 people on Facebook, on Instagram. The logic of the social network tends to put things in kind of a meritocratic and individualistic way, that, oh, okay, I'm doing this live, so that's it. I don't need to think about outreach programs, and I don't think I need to think about how I reach the local communities around my university. Of course, because I'm doing digital history, I'm doing live discussions. So this is what public history is for me, and I think we need to shift from that. We need to avoid that. It's a good thing that these things are happening, but we must not fool ourselves that this is public history in its crude sense. We are only when you're talking to the camera, you're talking to the camera. The public doesn't get to interact with you directly. You have a barrier that is impossible to overcome through digital means. And of course, digital means do a long way, and I think they must be used, and they must be used on the right way. But it's a vicious path when you rely solely on this. So I think we need to think well how our habits have changed after the pandemic. So that's my stance on that. I'm kind of a pessimistic or cautious about this matter.
Here in Brazil, we and probably all over the world, we have seen lots of infectologists and physicians in the news every day, talking about the pandemic, talking about the coronavirus. And it has raised a discussion about also what role can social science in general, but historians in particular, what role they can have also in those discussions. How was that in your contexts? I mean, were historians listening in the news, in the discussions about the coronavirus? Do you think that we managed as historians to have a important role this time, showing this what was specific and what was different about this pandemic in relation to other pandemics that happened in history? I mean, do you think that we as historians contribute to the public discussions during the coronavirus, or we could have done more? Lina, can you start?
So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about the role of the public historian in this COVID-19 pandemic compared with other kind of stuff. So I'll just like briefly talk about how the kind of social responsibilities that I always value in being a public historian is that as I talked a little earlier, that you try not to be afraid of the conflicts and try to work within the system with some political creativity. So that's the kind of role that I should, I think public historians should play in this kind of crisis. So with the digital media this time, first it's a little bit different. The COVID-19 pandemic is a little bit different than compared with other natural human-made disasters. It's unexpected, but the most unusual part is that a large number of people were limited in the kind of space, but they're perfectly healthy, so they can do a lot of stuff. They are actually doing a lot of stuff. So when it comes to the public historians in China, or historians in general in China, I think in a lot of ways they've already started to take on projects. They're working in public health field and also in the public history field. They started to do a bunch of working with students or do a lot of research projects. And so actually the Chinese government is very pro this kind of COVID-19 research. So right after, in the middle of the pandemic, we actually have the extra opportunity to apply the National Social Science Fund, special funds, just to research and to research and also support the projects for the COVID-19 research, not only in the science part, but also in the social science and the humanities part. I think part of the reason is that, our public history is primarily technological driven. So you just can't really talk about public history or doing public history without thinking about the technology. So right now, projects talking about just the humanities and social science, oral history. So at different scales, it's already started out. And when history information goes online, people start to consciously collect some of the COVID-19 material cultures, and they try to do the community projects. And so those are really grassroots. And also some are supported by the government and some are just like a volunteer. So as I said, it's very, you have this digital, or another part, let me back out a little bit, is the digital history is also a part, of the public history projects, during the COVID-19. So as I said, the role of public historians is part is conscious, a part is self-conscious, but, with this kind of crisis, because of it's very unusual. So I see a lot of historians are more proactive documenting and collecting COVID-19 stories, whereas the previous oral history and public history and digital history are more reactive and informational and archival, that kind of thing. With this one, I see more creativities, as Tanya was just mentioned. You know, it's very, it's grassroots and it's enthusiastic, and you know, some of them unpaid. You know, they're investing their labor and heart, you know, which is quite kind of unusual, and that's why I get a little bit excited when talking about this kind of small projects. In terms of the actual role that public historian can play, so that means, you know, we take on research, we involve publics, and you know, they are one of the professors from one university in China, they just you know, just one of his class, he asked students document in their lives in 3 pages during the quarantine the period, and the students responded in various formats. You know, they use material culture, use the oral history, use the visuals, use the digital stuff. You know, it's very creative, but overwhelmingly passionate about. So you see this kind of consciousness, you know, and so students want to do this, and you know, the more they're as a special group of public, but you have another public, you know, which is more general in a sense. They start to try to collect all the this kind of experiencing, collect a different kind of history objects, and try to interpret them totally at a grassroots level. That is something that you will not see in the previous, you know, crisis or national regional crisis in China.
Pedro?
Well, I actually think that public historians in Brazil have not, I think social sciences in general have not been called to orient government policies during the pandemic. I think that it's kind of an understatement, but I think we do have a role, and I think we have been trying to do that. I think this platform right here is Starting Quarentena is kind of a response to that. One thing about Wikipedia, I think it's my place here to put that. I was actually looking on the daily visualizations of the articles on COVID-19 and the 1918 Spanish flu article. And while since January, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 article was one of the most accessed ones, since March, the 1918 Spanish flu has been more accessed every day than the coronavirus article itself. So I think this shows how people are trying to cope with the experience of this new experience of the COVID-19 that got us unprepared and got us, well, on our houses, and this brings a lot of anxiety for people. And I think there is a search to historicize this moment that we're living. Have we as the human race, have we as a country, have we as people passed through this before? How did we pass this before? So in a way, I think not only thinking about archival projects, about this current experience, that I think Lina talked about this really well, and I think this is a trend that is happening worldwide. The International Federation is actually mapping out the different archival practices on COVID-19 experiences right now. But I think that we as historians have this role also of showing people, okay, we're during this pandemic now. What was the historical experience of people that passed through pandemics before? Not only the 1918 Spanish flu, but also that the 19th century pandemics, Middle Ages pandemics, and I think in a way there has been a lot of content about that. I currently am researching this boom of podcasts here in Brazil that really exploded in the last year. 2019 was the year of history podcasts in Brazil, and I think podcasting in general. And there has been a lot of exposure about these histories about the Spanish influenza of 1918. You open up Amazon or other bookstores, digital bookstores, there are a lot of books about these pandemics of old. But I think we as historians, in a broad sense, I think thinking about Brazil, on the TV networks and the public discourse, the more the larger public discourse, I think this kind of we were not called to do that. And the few times I saw something about the historical past of the pandemics, there were not historians talking about that, or one historian once, but you have a lot of journalists, and this is one thing that we have a lot of. This is a huge trauma, I think, for Brazilian historiography. We have a lot of problems. We had in the last decade. I think today is more okay. But we have a lot of problems with journalists that write popular and bestseller history, while we as historians don't get to this kind of public editorial market or even TV network, let's say, visual or social place. And I think, of course, this is a trend that happens, I think, in other countries, but this is something that I think is one of the issues here in Brazil. We as historians lost our place, I think, as of social importance in the public discourse. We are not seen generally as people that have something to say. And yeah, I think during this pandemic, we are not the history is not exactly the priority here. Well, in Brazil, we're in the middle, the rising curve of the pandemic right now, and we have a lot of people dying nowadays. And I think, that we are not the priority exactly, but also we have the place of guarding and collecting these memories and this pain and this loss of people and this trauma that is the pandemic, of this historical experience that is the pandemic. And I think this has been done, but I think more could have been done. So that's it.
Tanya?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to go in a minute, Lucas, because my public history students are waiting for me in a little while, and I've got to teach them.
Lina has to go too. I thought we had time to a last question, but
I can answer. Can I just answer very quickly? I was parallel a lot of what Pedro just said, but I've got a friend, and there's many more scientists are on our tellies and on our news and in our newspapers than our social scientists or historians. But I have a friend and colleague, Peter Hobbins, who before he became a prominent public historian was a medical historian and is an expert on the impact of the Spanish flu pandemic in Australia. And he's been in so many of our news outlets talking about the parallels or not with that historical example. So I think there are some fantastic opportunities if you have the expertise and the capacity in order to kind of meet the needs of journalists and others. And as I'm sure is the case with you, Pedro, in Brazil, that, the people who are the bestsellers are journalists, right? Those people writing history books are journalists rather than historians. And I think it's important that we all come to the history party. But yes, I think that there's a certain form of historical scholarship that does need to be aired at in these historical moments. But Peter is also involved with an organisation called the Professional Historians Association that we have here in Australia, that is a lobbying group and a support network for public historians. And it seems to me that lots of different countries could benefit from organisations like that, to encourage the practice of public history. But yeah, I think there are some great examples. But thank you so much, Lucas.
I thank you. I think Lina's students also are waiting for her. So
can I just spend 10 minutes, 10 seconds to just,
okay.
tell you, I know, Tanya, you have to go and I have a class to teach, but, we just started this large scale, public history oral projects in China about collecting and curating and archiving the history and memory of the COVID-19 pandemic in China, which is sharing an oral history. So we're applying the grants, but right now, even without grant, we start to do some ground, breaking words, and so the end product is we're imagining a national digital memory bank or something for oral history and digital storytelling about the COVID-19. So it's a lot of discussions we can do as the international scale. So that's, I just want to throw that out, you know, maybe another conversation, but that's what we're working on at this point. Thank you very much for putting this together. It's not easy. You know, it's, yeah, I'm happy to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, it was very nice. I thank you very much also, Lina, Tanya, Pedro, in name of all the Studying Quarantena organizers and coordinators. Thank you very much. I hope, well, we won't take more time of our students. And bye-bye. I hope we can, as Lina said, and meet again and keep going with this talk. Thank you very much.
And maybe in person one day. Maybe in person, but who knows? That would be lovely. Yeah.
You never know. But thank you very much. And
Thank you.
take
Thank you so much.
care, everybody. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.